Hello, right back again. And so at the end of the last segment, I expressed my hope that we have a sense of having displayed before us enough aspects and elements of this question so that we can try to approach it in a critical way. And so again, this was a big part of this project has been, and this has been a continuous project. This has been with us for the span of the whole semester, which is exploring and inquiring critically into the meaning of the term intelligence, right? And this is of course critical if we want to have if we actually want to have a standard against which to evaluate artificial intelligence. We have to know what intelligence is in order to evaluate it. In order to evaluate its simulation or its replication or its artificial example. And so then the other part of this kind of groundwork was to, in some ways, attempt to understand the meaning of artificial, and that also has been a project that has been with us since before this week. And I'm specifically thinking of the discussions we've had on the topic of technology. And then again, I think it's the question of artificial intelligence itself it's clear that it's a pertinent question to the time that we're all living in today. And again, I suggested the Matrix movie that came out around the year 2000. It really sort of galvanized or brought out that problem and that concern in a much more public and much more widely appreciated way than it may have been before. It's clear also that goes hand in hand with the degree of capacity that computers had achieved by that time, and then since then they've only continued. The computing power and capacity has only increased since then. So it's clearly a critical question in our times, in the times that we're living, and it brings, especially with the Matrix, gives such a stark example of a sort of fear that is kind of latent in the collective awareness or collective consciousness, which is, here we are making use of all these things. Now, what happens when these things start to make use of us? It's almost a sense of like a slave revolt, or like this cast of objects that we have kind of put to our use instrumentally, that they might somehow turn the tables, right? And this is again what the Matrix movie tapped into and presented. It wasn't the first one to do that, but it's one that did it in a memorable and visually impressive way. That being said, it's not a new idea at all, and in our discussion of technology, we even talked about this, that in fact it might have already been happening since the very beginning, and we just haven't been paying attention. By happening since the very beginning, I'm specifically referring to the notion that this thing we think that we're using, we think we are using technology, and that we are making use of technology, and that we're shaping material into these tools that we use. It might be the case that it's been also shaping us all along. Like, it's a reciprocal process. We've been making technology, but technology has also been making us in its. We've been making technology more or less in our image, but at the same time, technology may have been making us, turning us into its image in ways that we just haven't paid attention to. And one way that I suggested that we might look at this is that technology it really conditions us to in some ways prioritize efficiency above everything else, right? And this is not. It's obvious why efficiency would be an important something important to consider. But I think it's not too much of a stretch to imagine how, well, anything that out of its proportion will become, problematic in some way, and I think it's not a stretch for us to picture, and this is a discussion we had weeks ago, so we don't have to enter into it today again, but I suggested that it's actually quite straightforward to see the way in which technology conditions us to only notice certain things and to discount other things as less important. And in fact, those things that technology conditions us to notice, those are not the kind of things we probably would notice, except for the fact that we have been, in some ways, shaped by the technology we use. And so again, I just think that only underscores how timely this specific question of artificial intelligence is, and I don't want to suggest that it's too late, but it's like it might not be something we have to think about in the future. It might be happening as we speak, and in some ways it might have already happened. We won't know though unless we're willing to wonder about it. And so again, rather than thinking we're going to come out of this discussion, this week's theme with a number of answers that we can just sort of carry around in our pockets or something like that. Instead of that way of thinking about knowledge, which in the past we've kind of defined as a naive way of thinking about knowledge, as though knowledge is just an assemblage of facts or propositions. And so no, we're hoping to come out of this week with maybe even with more questions, but the ability to ask more questions, the ability to know which questions are important to ask, right? And this is something to do with critical thinking as we've been conceiving of it the entire semester. And so what we're essentially just doing in this particular theme of technology is we're attempting to apply these same principles that have been with us since the beginning and since we discussed on the first day. And so maybe we could just return again to the Turing test and the idea that if something seems intelligent, then in fact it is. And just think about that a little bit more, and we can even imagine something like so does a book, if you have a book, does the book know what is written in the book? Like, I'm thinking of knowledge and it's similar to intelligence. Like, is the book intelligent, or does it? In what way is the book intelligent? Is maybe a better, more critical way to pose that question. We could also think of a clock. Like, the clock tells the time, but does it know? But does the clock know the time? And this is again, I think, a question of intelligence, similar to the one in the book. It's like the book tells you the text, or you can read the meaning from the text there. But does the book know the meaning? And similarly, does the clock know the time? It tells the time, but does it know the time? Now, this is clearly, now we're establishing. Again, I'm reminded of earlier contexts in which we've established a similar differentiation and between something like sight and insight, or appearance and meaning, right? Or information and understanding of that information. And so, and now let's just carry this a little bit further, and we can take the clock, and I think it's a good example because this evolution, I think, will be clear why I think it's a good example. Suppose you have a clock that is programmed to not only tell you that, not only you can tell the time by looking at it, by reading it, but suppose it's a clock that it's programmed that that actually reads off the time. And when you say, what time is it, the clock will actually tell you the time. Literally, it will speak the time. And so you can imagine some engineer in a laboratory, a team of engineers in a laboratory somewhere, programming this clock so that through all of the numbers that it would, 24 hours a day, etc., that it would tell you what time it was. I think it's, and so we just allowed that picture in our minds, the clock, and not only does it tell the time, but it tells you the time if you ask it. I still think it would be a stretch for everyone. I think it's safe to say to suppose that nothing really, nothing in principle has changed from the way the clock was before. I think it's safe to say. It's not as though that by being programmed to speak out the time as well, that it's also, that it somehow achieved a level of I guess, inwardness, the ability to, that it also, in the sense that it also knows, it doesn't have to know the time in order to say the time. And then the reason, what I talked about as the evolution before, why I thought the clock was a good example, is because now you do have, these devices by different tech companies. I'm thinking of the clock by Amazon, or the software too in a Apple phone named Siri, that you can actually ask her questions and she responds to you. And this is clearly you can see the pertinence of the Turing Test in that case, and Siri and Alexa, the Amazon artificial intelligence. They're both designed with the Turing Test in mind, and by that I mean the engineers are continually challenging themselves with programming this thing so that it responds in a way that simulates a human response, right? And so I hope these different elements are beginning to reveal how they're all interrelated and connected. And so this is clearly again an example of the Turing Test kind of in action. But then we should just try to keep the progression in mind. If we have the clock, and the clock that speaks the time, and then the Amazon box that, sure, if you ask Alexis or Alexa, I think she will tell you the time. If you ask her, she will tell you a lot of other things too. In fact, she has, in some ways, we can see immediately where this will take us, because we might ask Alexa or Google or Apple. You can ask these programs. You can ask them questions. They have access to almost infinite, just terabytes of data that they have immediate access to through the internet. In some way, it's then very tempting to conclude that in fact our own capacity is relatively insignificant compared to these programs, and so again, I think this just underscores how this is a very real question for us to be considering today, especially with the rate of the development of these technologies. But again, I want to encourage us to think critically about this and say, what has really changed along this progression, going from the clock that tells the time? And I use the clock that tells the time as a starting point, just because I think that's something that we all intuitively will agree on, in the sense that the clock does not know the time. The clock is not intelligent. The clock is designed so that it moves at a certain rate. The hands move around the face at a certain rate, and that's correspond. But if somebody thinks the clock is intelligent, we could go to a tree casting a shadow and kind of like an original sundial, and say that in some way that tells the time to a person that knows how to read it, right? And then go from there, and say, I guess, ask ourselves, what has changed in this progression? Something must have changed, because otherwise we wouldn't think of it as a progression from the clock. And it's obvious what has changed, that many things have changed. But we should also ask ourselves, in order to be critical and comprehensive, we should say what hasn't changed, going from a clock, going from this one technology to the next one, to the next one, to the next one. And this again it's a question not to immediately again have a ready-made pat answer to it, but it's right. So the most important thing is to be able to really enter this question and say, what has changed, but also what hasn't changed. And I think that ideas or questions that we've encountered earlier in the semester too, I hope that we can bring those. hope that those can remain present with us. Now, as we move forward, I hope we're not leaving everything behind us. I'm thinking specifically in this case of a discussion we had in the class, and we actually came up just in the class in the process of developing our common language, our lingua franca in this class. We came up with the term something like dimensions of the self, or dimensions of life, or dimensions of inwardness. We were talking about this in several different contexts. One of them was Aristotle's division of the psyche, the psyche, the psyche, which is also we think of it as dimensions of life, right? So there's plant life, which creates its form and nourishes and sustains its form, and also propagates itself through time, perpetuates. And then that's one. And if you consider a plant compared to a stone, it's clear that something has happened in the plant. They both have outer shapes that are perceptible to the sight, but and then to really though comprehend what's different about the plant, we need a kind of insight that enables us to see this sort of further dimension of being, which we then begin to call life, that's present in the plant and not present as such in the rock. And this is a discussion we had, and so this is kind of a recapitulation. But then if we look at a bird, for example, or an animal, then, or a bird or a fox or any kind of animal, we will see something, again, a sort of further intensification is maybe a word for it, but we called it dimension is the word that we used in the discussion. You can see that not only is the animal kind of, again, sustaining its form, building its form, and also sustaining its form, and propagating through time, but it's also kind of responding immediately to sensory. So it's internalizing more of its environment than the plant, right? It's like it's taken. It's again sort of enfolded into itself and has this ability to sense the environment, to respond. It has desires and preferences that impel it to motor activity. The plant is more or less rooted in spot, right, with some exceptions of like dispersal of seeds, for example. But more or less the plant, it doesn't have locomotion. And the animal, though, and this is intimately related to the ability to sense, have sensations. And sensations, it's like you turn something into, so you have an environment, but it's like you're able to turn that environment into, introvert the environment and turn it into an inner experience as an animal. And then this is, again, directly related to then responding to those internalizations, and through locomotion is probably the primary means of responding to those sensory, what is received through the senses. And then we also suggested that there could be further dimensions of inwardness and inwardization. And we suggested that in fact our ability to carry on that discussion as such, and to even inquire into this question of whether there are dimensions of life in the first place, that itself might be a sign, or might be an expression of one of these further dimensions of inwardness. And we noted that Aristotle indeed thought that, and he called this dimension dianoetikon. It's kind of the rational soul. But more than recapitulating that discussion, the reason that I wanted to bring it up was to encourage us to make use of that way of thinking and say, what has something like the Deep Blue chess program that prevailed over the world, the Grand Master chess champion in 1996 or 7. How do we think about that situation, or something like like Siri, whom you can pose any kind of question and she'll respond to you by combing through terabytes worth of data encoded in databases over the whole globe, right? Access through the instant access to the internet like that, and then performing calculations, right? How do we think of this how do we compare this to or if we bring these two questions together, like, okay, the inwardness of life and the intensification of that inwardness, the dimensions is the word that we use, the dimensions of that inwardness in life. Does artificial intelligence, how do we think about dimensions of inwardness with artificial intelligence? Is that even, does that even make sense? And if it doesn't make sense, what does that suggest about what we're confronted with in a question like artificial intelligence? It's clear that the Turing Test, for example, is not addressing inwardness one way or the other. And we might say, like, well, inwardness, you can't measure it in the first place, and so that's not a good test for intelligence. Like, if we're wondering about how intelligent a computer is, you can't measure inwardness. It's kind of like a philosophical concept, and so we need a test that is actionable, and something like the Turing Test is much more actionable, at least, than just kind of some abstract notion of dimensions of inwardness. But at the same time, we should say again, and I mentioned this earlier, that nothing guarantees that there should be a sort of a quick litmus test like that. It's a complicated question, something like intelligence, and in some ways we shouldn't expect a simple answer to a complicated question like that. I hope that, again, that my intention with these videos, it's really to help us conceptualize these questions in a way that then can be conducive to further discussions. And so in these videos, I am attempting to limit my answers and try to maximize my questions and my articulation of these questions for us. But it's probably clear that I have my opinion about my own thoughts and my own opinion about this particular one. And so at the risk of contradicting myself and not giving any different answers, I'll try to be a little bit vague by concluding with a story. It may be an apocryphal story, but it's about Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe. And as some of you may know, he got his start. He eventually became the president of the 16th president of the United States, and I think his name will be familiar to everyone. But he got his start as a prosecutor in, I know he grew up in Kentucky. I'm not sure where he was practicing law, but as a prosecutor, and he earned his nickname Honest Abe. And it's probably an anecdote about Abraham Lincoln, was that in trial one day as the prosecutor, he approaches the defendant and he says, in the way that the lawyer will kind of establish a baseline and try to reveal or demonstrate to the jury what kind of character the defendant has. Abraham Lincoln poses this question. He says, he asks the defendant, how many legs does a horse have? And the defendant responds, 4 legs. The horse has 4 legs. And Abraham Lincoln says, sure. What though if so the horse has 4 legs, what if I call the tail of the horse a leg? How many legs does the horse have then? And the defendant just kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, 5. And Abraham Lincoln says, no, you're wrong this time. Me calling it a leg doesn't make it a leg. Me calling a tail a leg doesn't make a tail a leg. So I will conclude on that note, and I hope to I hope to I hope that this isn't really a conclusion, because I think we can consider and continue all of these thoughts on the discussion board and also in weeks to follow. So thank you for your time and your attention today, and best wishes until next time.